Maria Montessori, Her Life and Work by E. M. Standing. Part 1, Life of Dr. Maria Montessori. Chapter 1, Preparation, and what you're getting. Section 1, Early Years. When I was at school, we had a teacher whose fixed idea was to make us learn by heart the lives of famous women in order to incite us to imitate them. The exhortation which accompanied these narrations was always the same. You should try to become famous. Would you not like to become famous? Oh, no, I replied dryly one day. I shall never be that. I care too much for the children of the future to add yet another biography to the list. In spite of this praiseworthy desire, fame did come to that schoolgirl when she grew up, and with it, yet another biography to add to the list. Maria Montessori was born at Caravel in the province of Ancona on August 31st in the year of 1870, the year in which Italy first became a united nation. Her father, Alessandro Montessori, was descended from a noble family from Bologna. He was a typical conservative of the old school, a military man who, in his time, had been commended for bravery in action. To the end of his life he was dignified and soldierly in his bearing, and well known for his punctilious politeness. Dr. Montessori's mother was Renilda Stoppani, niece of the illustrious Antonio Stoppani, the great philosopher, scientist, priest, to whom the University of Milan erected a monument at his death. Renilde Montessori was a lady of singular piety and charm, and between the daughter and the mother, whom she resembled in appearance and temperament, there grew up an affection and understanding which remained unchanged through all the vicissitudes of Maria's life until death separated them in the year 1912. There are still some people who think that the Montessori method consists in allowing children to do just what they like. This was emphatically not the method employed in Maria's home. Her mother believed in discipline, and Maria's life was none the less happy on account of it. One day, on coming back from a month's holiday, little Maria began to complain. I am hungry. I want something to eat. You must wait a little while, dear, replied the mother. But the child would not wait, and became so insistent that her mother, opening a cupboard and finding a piece of bread left there from a month before, said, If you cannot wait, take this. Every day Maria had to do a certain amount of knitting for the poor. This certainly could not have been a trial for her, for even as a child she showed interest in those less fortunate than herself. In her neighborhood was a hunchbacked girl. Pitying her condition, Maria made special friends with her, and used to take her out for walks as often as possible. This good intention did not, however, bring equally good results, for the contrast between the two girls was so striking that in the end her mother tactfully suggested that this plan should be dropped and other means found to help the unfortunate girl. Another incident in her childhood is recorded which also has somewhat of a prophetic note. On one occasion it happened that there was a sharp difference of opinion between her parents. Little Maria took a chair, dragged it to a position between them, climbed up on it, and then joined their hands together as tightly as she could. Just as we shall find her all her life interested in the underdog, so she has always tended to be a peacemaker. In fact, her whole life's work could be summed up as an effort to bring to an end the age-long struggle which has been waged and still is being waged between the child and the adult, a struggle which, as we shall see later, is no less real because it is carried on unconsciously. Maria's childhood was spent in Ancona, where she attended the usual state day school. As a young child, it would seem that she was without any special scholastic ambitions. One day she met one of her little companions crying bitterly because she had not been moved up into another class. I could not understand this, said Montessori, because, as I told her, one room seemed to me just as good as another. Maria must have seemed at times a rather odd and puzzling child, and not only to her teachers, but to her school companions. When playing with these, she was generally the leader. She would sometimes make the most unexpected remarks, as when, to express her disapproval, she would exclaim contemptuously, You! Why are you not even born yet? Was she, even at that time, dimly aware of her doctrine that the development of the individual can be described as a succession of new births at consecutively higher levels? Anyway, her companions objected to this treatment, complaining to their parents, She says we're not even born yet! Maria herself had a great sense of personal dignity even as a child. One day, one of the teachers spoke disparagingly of the expression in her eyes, quigli occhi, in her hearing. As a protest, Maria never raised those eyes in the presence of that teacher again. This incident, trifling in itself, is worth recording in view of the great importance Montessori placed in her system of treating even the smallest child with a respect that amounts almost to reverence. It is interesting, too, to note that she found it easier to protest against an infringement of her personal dignity by an adult than by her companion. Witness the remark she once made to one of these. "Please remind me that I have made up my mind never to speak to you again." Reader's notes. I am missing part of the introduction, and it would be $18 to get it, so sorry, guys. I should also mention the language. This was written in the 1950s by somebody who had more of a linguistic style of the early 1900s. So if you have issues with any of the language in this, take it up with them. I don't believe in rewriting history. It's just written the way it is, and you take it how it comes. Some of it is rather charming, and I think that should make the rest easier to digest. We just use different language than they do. To give an example, brownie points became a good thing in our day and age. You don't want to know what it was back in her day. Section 2. Choosing a career. Anything but a teacher. When Maria was about 12 years old, her parents moved to Rome so as to be able to give their only child a better education than Ancona could offer. But even with the educational advantages of the metropolis, it was not easy to satisfy the ambitions of this singular child. She already had her own ideas as to her own education. At the age of 14, she became very interested in mathematics, an interest which she retained all her life. Her parents suggested that she should take up teaching, which was practically the only career open to women at that time. But this she categorically refused even to consider. Anything but this. Since she had an aptitude for mathematics, and was very fond of it, she decided that she would take up the career of engineering. Even at the present day, note 1950s, war emergencies excepted, that would be rather an unusual career for a woman, but in those days it was unthought of, as the high-class seminaries for young ladies did not cater for such an unusual ambition. Maria attended classes at a technical school for boys. After a while, her taste again changing, she felt more strongly the attractions of biology. But in time, the sensitive period for this having passed, she came to the final decision that what she really wanted was to study medicine. Unfortunately, this was a case of jumping out of the frying pan and into the fire. A young lady to attend a medical school? The thing was unheard of, preposterous, impossible. All the Italian Mrs. Grundys raised their hands in pious horror. This young lady cared not a whit, but snapping her fingers at all of them, managed to obtain an interview with Dr. Bocelli, head of the Board of Education. When he informed her in quite definite terms that it would be impossible for her to carry out her project, she thanked him politely, shook hands cordially, and quietly remarked, "I know I shall become a doctor of medicine." Thereupon she bowed and went out. We cannot follow all the details of her struggle. Suffice it to say that she had her way in the end, and was duly admitted to the medical faculty of the university, the first woman medical student in Italy. And what is more, she won a scholarship, in fact a series of scholarships, year after year. She further augmented her income whilst a student by giving private tuition. In fact, she very largely paid her own way through her university career, a point which is worth noting in connection with the ideas she was to put forth in later life as to the value of economic independence in adolescent development. Section 3. Trials of Student Days. Once admitted to the Faculty of Medicine, this intrepid girl by no means found herself at the end of her difficulties. The men students, jealous of this intrusion into their sphere hitherto exclusively their own, subjected her to a series of petty persecutions for many months. They soon discovered, however, that she was not to be frightened away. She confronted her tormentors with such pluck that in time persecution was changed to a sort of grudging admiration. Typical of her good-humored indifference to their attacks was the remark she used to make to some of the students, who, when passing her in the corridors, used to emit a contemptuous sound. "Pooh! Blow away, my friends," she would cheerfully reply. "The harder you blow, the higher up I shall go." There was a force of character in this girl student, a something or other about her that impressed even those light-hearted medical students. One of these, who used to sit behind her in the lecture room, had developed a habit of making a kind of trembling movement with his foot, so that Maria felt the vibrations transmitted to her desk. She did not like this, and turning her head round, looked angrily at her fellow student. He stopped the movement at once, whispering to his neighbor, "I am immortal." "What makes you say that?" was the whispered reply. "If I weren't, I should be dead. Did you see the look she gave me?" "In those days," I once heard Montessori remark, "I felt as if I could have done anything. and certainly it seemed that for her, difficulties existed simply to be overcome. When the present writer was in Rome, he met an aged professor who had been a lecturer in the medical faculty at the time we are speaking about. This gentleman related an incident which stood out in his memory after many years. It happened one day, he said, when he was due to lecture, that a tremendous snowstorm swept over Rome. It was a blizzard of such exceptional severity that all his students failed to turn up, all except one, his girl student. The latter, finding herself the only person in the auditorium, modestly suggested the professor should postpone his lecture. He would not hear of it. Such zeal should not go unrewarded, so the lecture was given as usual to an audience of one. Maria had to face other difficulties at the university of a more terrifying nature than animosity of the men students. In those days it was not considered proper that a girl should dissect dead bodies in the presence of men students, so her practical work in the dissecting room had to be done by herself, and this meant that she was obliged to pass many hours alone amongst the corpses, very often in the evening after darkness had set in. It needed a good deal of determination to carry on such a macabre setting. Furthermore, her way was made still more difficult on account of the opposition of her father, who disapproved of the career she had chosen. Reader's notes. There's actually a movie in Spanish about this, if you're interested. I think it's called Montessori. It shows what it was like and how creepy it was to be among those bodies. And honestly, there are some things in it that aren't in this book, one of which I consider plausible based on some of the evidence. Anyway, sorry for my pronunciation of men and girl students, but it just cracked me up because he just said the men students, and the way he wrote it just made me laugh for some reason. Section 4, A Prophetic Incident. We are not surprised to learn that, under the oppressive burden of these and still other difficulties, the spirit of the young pioneer came almost to a breaking point. One day, overwhelmed by a feeling of despair, the young girl student determined to abandon the unequal struggle against the sea of troubles. She therefore left the dissecting room with her mind quite made up to seek another career less strewn with obstacles. It happened that her way home led through the Pincio Park, which at that hour was almost empty of people. As she walked along, thinking of her decision, she passed a shabbily dressed woman, accompanied by a child of some 2 years of age. The woman was disheveled and dirty, a professional beggar, and began at once to beg for alms as Montessori approached. It was not the woman, however, but the child who was destined to alter the course of her life. Whilst the mother tuned up her professional wine, the little child, quite unconcerned, continued to sit on the ground playing with a small piece of colored paper. There was something in the child's expression, so serenely happy in the possession of that worthless scrap of colored paper, observing it with the full absorption of its little soul, that suddenly, to the student watching, it brought an inner experience best described in the words of Matthew Arnold's Buried Life. It was as though a bolt was shot back somewhere in the breast, and a lost pulse of feeling stirred again. Moved by emotion she could not herself explain, she turned round and went straight back to the dissecting room. From that moment her revulsion to the work in those uncongenial surroundings left her, never to return. From that moment, too, she never doubted that she had a vocation. After relating this incident in a conversation, Montessori went on to say, "I cannot explain it. It just happened like that. You will probably think it a very silly story, and if you told it to others, they would probably just laugh at it." In this we see an example of that mysterious affinity which exists deep in the soul of the genius, toward that work which he is destined to perform, and everything connected with it. It was the same with Froebel, as we shall show in a later chapter. Both he and Montessori were sent into the world to shed new light on the unfathomed depths of the child's soul. At that time, and for many years to come, Montessori had no idea that she would find her life's mission in the sphere of education. Her life, taken as a whole, demonstrates the principle she was to preach in later years, that the preparations of life are indirect. When she was taken ill about this time, and her friends were anxious about her recovery, she said, "Do not be alarmed. I shall not die. I have a work to do. Ho de fare." Reader's notes. The talk of that expression on a child, so serenely happy and observing with full absorption of its little soul. When I learned some of Montessori under my mother, I remember seeing that in children. It's possibly the most beautiful look on the planet. I now try to see it in everyone, adults, animals, everywhere I can bring that out in someone. I want to see that look on their face.
Section 5, A Reconciliation. Though her father strongly disapproved of the line she had taken, her mother, Renilda Montessori, never doubted her daughter's ability to make good in the path she had chosen. Renilda was Montessori's constant friend and sympathizer, and helped her in every way she could. Happily, too, the estrangement between father and daughter was not destined to last forever. It was, in fact, terminated in rather a dramatic manner. It was a tradition in the medical school at that time that every new graduate should deliver a public lecture to the faculty after his first year. This was a sufficiently trying ordeal in any case, but especially so in hers. Prejudice was still running high, and many in the audience had come not only in a spirit of criticism, but prepared to create a disturbance. "I felt like a lion tamer that day," said Montessori in recalling the occasion. It happened that on that particular morning, when this lecture was to take place, that a friend of Alessandro Montessori, meeting him in the street, remarked with some surprise, "Aren't you coming to the lecture?" "What lecture?" replied the father, who had lost touch with his daughter's doings. Explanations followed, and the result was that Alessandro was persuaded, rather against his will, to come to the lecture. The young doctor's triumph was as complete as Portia's. Her treatment of her theme was so brilliant, her delivery so faultless, her personality so fascinating, that all opposition was swept away, and she received a great ovation. Her father found herself the center of eager congratulations from all sides at having such a daughter. The ugly duckling had indeed turned out to be a swan. Maria Montessori thus became the first woman in Italy to take the degree of Doctor of Medicine. The same year, 1896, she was chosen to represent the women of Italy at a feminist congress held at Berlin. Here she championed the cause of the working women, and did so with such ardor and efficiency that her portrait appeared in the press of many countries. A few years later, 1900, she attained a similar congress in London. Here she attacked the practice of employing child labor in the mines of Sicily, and gave her support to a movement against the exploitation of child labor. It is interesting to notice at this point how, right from the beginning, we might perhaps best describe as fighting on behalf of the underdog. In almost the last conversation I had with Dr. Montessori, she was then over 80 years of age, she happened to mention that upon this, her first visit to England, she was entertained, along with other members of the Congress, by Queen Victoria herself, with whom she had had a conversation.
Section 6. And here comes the hard part with the language. Montessori comes in touch with deficient children. Okay, here we go. Another 10 years were to elapse before Dr. Montessori was to discover her great mission in life. 10 crowded years of the most incessant and varied labors, which we must now briefly outline. Soon after graduating, Dr. Montessori was appointed assistant doctor at the psychiatric clinic in the University of Rome. Part of her duty in this connection was to visit the asylums for the insane in Rome in order to select suitable subjects for the clinic. It was in this way that she was led to take an interest in idiot children, who at that period were classed together with the insane. Here again, it was a case of sympathy for the underdog. Her generous heart was touched by the piteous condition of these unfortunate children, and she longed to help them. But with her, it was not only a question of sympathy, a question of the heart. She used her head too. She saw these poor creatures and at their environment with an eye illuminated by the light of genius. The following anecdote is very revealing. In one of these lunatic asylums, she came across a number of these unhappy children herded together like prisoners in a prison-like room. The woman who looked after them did not attempt to conceal the disgust with which she regarded them. Montessori asked her why she held them in such contempt. "Because," the woman replied, "as soon as their meals are finished, they throw themselves on the floor to search for crumbs." Montessori looked around the room and saw that the children had no toys or materials of any kind, that the room was in fact absolutely bare. There were literally no objects in their environment which the children could hold and manipulate in their fingers. Montessori saw in the children's behavior a craving of a very different and higher kind than for mere food. There existed for these poor creatures, she realized, one path, and one only towards intelligence, and that was through their hands. Instinctively, the poor deficient mites had sought after that path by the only means in their reach.
The more Montessori came in contact with these defective children, studying them, meditating over their condition, longing to help them, the more strongly did she come to differ from the generally accepted views with regard to them. It became increasingly apparent to her that mental deficiency was a pedagogical problem rather than a medical one. She came to believe that, with special educational treatment, their mental condition could be immensely ameliorated, a view she found to be shared by the French doctors Jean Itard and Edouard Seguin, and a few others. She says that form of creation which was necessary for these unfortunate beings, so as to enable them to re-enter human society, to take their place in the civilized world and render them independent of the help of others, placing human dignity within their grasp, was a work which appealed so strongly to my heart that I remained in it for years. Reader's notes. In terms of some of the language, I would like you to at least remember one thing. No one meant any harm with these words. I'm sure, since it was common language, many didn't even think about it, even if some certainly meant it from a bad place. People in the old days didn't speak the way we do. And I would like to make a comparison between that horrible woman that basically got disgusted by the kids to Montessori, who instinctively loved them and saw their potential.
Section 7. Montessori, Directress of an Orthophrenic School. It was through her interest in defective children that Montessori came in contact with the works of Jean Itard and Edouard Seguin, the two French doctors mentioned above, who had developed their lives to the education of defectives. In this way, her own institutions on the subject were strengthened. In 1899, at a pedagogical congress in Turin, Montessori delivered an address on moral education. In this, she expressed her belief that defective children were not extrasocial beings, but were entitled to the benefits of education as much as, if not more than, normal ones. Such an interest was aroused in what was then, in Italy, a novel point of view that Dr. Guido Baccelli, the Minister of Education, invited Dr. Montessori to give a series of lectures in Rome on the education of the feeble-minded. She complied with this request, and, as a result of this course, which laid the foundation stone of scientific pedagogy in Italy, there came into being a state orthophrenic school. This was placed under the direction of Dr. Montessori, a position which she held for 2 years, 1899 to 1901. To this were brought from various day schools in Rome all those children who were regarded as hopelessly deficient. Later on, to this same institution were transferred also all the idiot children from the insane asylums in Rome. During these 2 years, Montessori, with the help of her colleagues, prepared a group of teachers in a special method of observation and in the education of feeble-minded children. She also visited London and Paris with the object of studying all the then known methods of dealing with such problems. Most important of all, upon her return, she gave herself up entirely to the actual teaching of the children herself. What his contemporaries said of Sir Walter Raleigh, we can also say of Dr. Montessori, that she has always shown the capacity to toil terribly. All day long, from 8 a.m. to 7 p.m., she would spend with the children, and then at night she would sit up late to make notes, tabulate, compare, analyze, and reflect, and prepare new materials. Those 2 years of practice, she remarks quaintly, are indeed my first and only true degree in pedagogy. Section 8. A Dawning Intuition. From the beginning of her work with defective children, Montessori had the feeling that the methods which she was using had nothing in them peculiarly limited to the instruction of idiots. Gosh, I don't like that word for that. Okay. On the contrary, she believed that they contained educational principles more rational than those generally in use. In fact, it was just because they were more rational that, through their means, an inferior mentality was enabled to develop. Under her skillful direction, the inferior mentality of these defective children, hitherto classed with the hopeless lunatics, developed to a remarkable and unexpected extent. Such indeed was her success that a number of idiot children from the asylums learned to read and write so well that they were able to present themselves with success at a public examination taken together with normal children. A chorus of applause greeted this seeming miracle, but Dr. Montessori's reflections took another course. Whilst everyone was admiring my idiots, I was searching for the reasons which could keep back the healthy and happy children of the ordinary schools on so low a plane that they could be equaled in tests of intelligence by my unfortunate pupils. The more deeply she pondered over this anomalous situation, the more strongly she did feel that the cause lay in the difference in educational principles. This feeling, so deep to be of the nature of an intuition, became my controlling idea. I became convinced that similar methods applied to normal children would develop and set free their personality in a marvelous and surprising way. Section 9. Preparing for an Unknown Future. Thus, in 1901, when Montessori gave up her work with the deficients in the orthophonic school at Rome, she was already contemplating the question of the teaching of normal children. Yet 7 years were to pass before her theories were put into practice and her intuitions confirmed. For this delay there were various reasons. In the first place, she felt the need for further study and meditation. Although she was already a lecturer at the university, she registered again as a student and attended courses on philosophy and psychology. We can indeed apply to her own development the words which later on she wrote to a young teacher, who was to become one of her most able and ardent followers. To collect one's forces, even when they seem to be scattered, and when one's aim is only dimly perceived, this is a great action, and will sooner or later bring forth fruits. Of this period, she writes herself, it was almost as if I was keeping myself for an unknown mission. Looking back over the first piece of Montessori's career, we can easily see how all that she did turned out to be preparation, and a most fitting preparation, for the great discovery she was to make at a later period. But we must not make the mistake of reading her future into the past. Before it came, it was still the future, and it was still unknown to her. That she felt she had some sort of special mission to perform is clear, but exactly what that mission was, or how she would fill it, was still beyond her ken. She could only see her... Sorry, sound of music in my head. She could only see her way a step at a time. The future was still shrouded in a mist, and would have to reveal itself stage by stage. Montessori was certain that, if she did her part fully in the present, the future would look after itself. In spite of Dr. Montessori's rigorously scientific training and the immensely practical nature of her work, there was a deeper and mystical side to her personality. To her, the art of life consisted primarily of adjusting oneself to those unseen but beneficent influences which operate through the lives of men and events. Therefore, she never unduly strove to force events, believing, like Hamlet, as a result of her experience, that there is a divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them how we will. I once heard her, in a conversation, expound a theory that the art of life consists in learning how to be obedient to events. Superficially, this might give the impression of a fatalistic surrender to an external destiny, but it meant nothing of the kind. Rightly understood and illustrated as she gave it by reference to her own career, it signified rather a life full of generous acceptances of duties. It's of hard achievements leading to unexpected developments along the line of her genius. Thus it came about that her life was like a path leading through narrow defiles to sudden horizons, a series of experiences linking themselves together to prepare the next step. In fact, her theory of obedience to events, far from being fatalistic, is much more in line with what Emerson meant when he said, "The way of life is wonderful. It is by abandonment." At the great crises of her life, she was aware of a mysterious urge within her, something deeper than mere reason, almost as if, like Socrates, she had a demon within her that knew more than she did. Section 10. A second period of study. When the moment came which would reveal to her this unknown mission, she would be ready for it. Meanwhile, as we have said above, she felt the need of a deeper and more complete preparation. During this second period of study, Montessori made much more thoroughgoing study of the works of Itard and Ch1, for whose work she had a deep admiration. Itard, who lived at the time of the French Revolution, made a special study of deaf-mutes. He is perhaps best known for his education of an idiot boy who was found abandoned in the forest of Aveyron. It was an undertaking of almost incredible patience, which he recorded in a book, The Care and Education of the Wild Boy of Aveyron. Dr. Edouard Ch1, who was a student under Itard, later founded a school for deficients in Paris. Here he achieved such brilliant successes that his fame spread far and wide. In fact, he received the highest praise from the Academy of France. Ch1 wrote an account of his methods in a book entitled Traitement Moral, Hygiene and Education des Idiots. This volume embodied his 10 years' experience with defectives in his school at Paris. So highly did Montessori value the works of Itard and Seguin, to use her own words, I translated into Italian and copied out my own hand the writing of these two men from beginning to end. Seguin's book alone was 600 pages long, making for myself books as the Benedictines did before diffusion of the art of printing. I chose to do this by hand in order that I might have time to weigh the sense of each word and read in truth the spirit of the authors. In later life, Seguin emigrated to the United States of America, where he founded many institutions for defectives, and where, after the lapse of another 20 years, he published a second account of his educational method under a different title, Idiocy, and its treatment by the physiological method. This was published in English in the United States of America in 1866. Montessori had heard of the book, but for a long time was unable to obtain a copy. She describes how, in her search for it, when she visited London, she even went from house to house, to nearly all the English doctors who were known to be specially interested in defective children or who supervised special schools. She had just finished translating and copying the 600 pages of Seguin's French volume when a copy of his second book arrived by post. This volume had been found amongst the books discarded from the private library of a New York physician. When the parcel was opened, the book looked so dusty and dirty that Alessandro Montessori insisted on having it disinfected before letting his daughter read it. This new and later volume of Seguin's dealt with the physiology of the experiences prescribed in his previous volume. In it, Seguin put forward the view that his physiological method, which has as its base the individual study of the pupil forming its educational methods upon the analysis of physiological and psychological phenomena, must come also to be applied to normal children, and when this was done he believed it would lead the way to a complete human regeneration. Reader's notes. I'll admit, hearing the word in another language almost made it seem less bad. And I couldn't help but wonder, as language tends to change based on how we use it, if that word was always meant to be a cruel thing. There may have been a kinder word once. There are several words in the English language that became bad, but were actually harmless on their own. If anyone knows, feel free to leave a comment. Section 11. Lecturer and Practicing Physician. During the 10 years that followed Dr. Montessori's graduation in 1896, her interests were by no means confined to defective children. She also made a special study of the nervous diseases of children, and from time to time published the results of her researches in technical journals. From 1896 to 1906, she occupied the chair of hygiene at the Maestro Femminile in Rome. Apologies for the butchery. One of the two women's colleges in Italy at that time, the other being in Florence. She was also one of the permanent external examinators in the Faculty of Pedagogy. It is interesting to note, in passing, that the other external examiner in those years was Luigi Pirandello, later well known as a playwright. Many of the students who studied under her at this time came to occupy important positions in training colleges all over Italy, carrying with them something of her fire and enthusiasm. In 1904, Dr. Montessori was made a professor at the University of Rome, where for 4 years she occupied the chair of anthropology. Her first major publication was a large volume entitled Pedagogical Anthropology. Reader's notes. So my mother studied Montessori. She didn't get to teach us as much as I would have liked, admittedly. We had a difficult home life, but the little she did, I appreciated, and at least left me a little advanced in school. Later in life, though, after I became disabled, I came to appreciate the stories that she told of her days in classes. She had actually studied under someone, I believe, related to Montessori, but definitely a student of Montessori personally. So yes, there's a certain passion in someone who learned directly, I think. And ever since, I'm a firm belief that if certain results don't come, and there's no physiological reason for it, then it's time to go back to studying, back to the drawing board. I don't believe in deficient teachers or deficient students, just a lack of resources. Section 12. Dr. Montessori as a University Lecturer. Anna Maccaroni gives an interesting account of her impressions when she first heard Montessori lecture on this subject at a course for teachers at the University of Rome in 1906. The hall was crowded with young people of both sexes. The lecturer remained standing during her discourse, and kept her eyes fixed on her audience with a penetrating look. I found out afterwards that Even with quite a large audience, she was able to somehow be conscious of each one individually with what one might describe as a kind of spiritual contact. I noticed at once that she was a very good-looking woman, but what impressed me more was that she did not follow the fashion of so many learned women of that time by dressing in a somewhat masculine style. Her attire, though simple, retained an elegant and feminine touch. In that opening lecture, she spoke not so much about anthropology as about schools, what the function of a school should be. She emphasized two main points. First, that it is the duty of the teacher to help rather than to judge. And second, that true mental work does not exhaust, but rather gives nourishment, food for the spirit. She was a most attractive lecturer with a manner that was easy and gracious. Everything that she said had the warmth of life. I remember some of the students saying, "Her lectures make us want to be good," which recalls the remark made by another teacher at another of her courses a year or two later. We do not understand all that she is trying to teach us, but we all find in it a spiritual stimulus. In addition to her work as a lecturer in the University of Rome and the Women's Training College, she also practiced in the clinics and hospitals in Rome, and, though it seems hard to believe it, even carried on a private practice of her own as well, for at least part of this period. Her patients, whether in hospital or in their homes, were never for her just cases, for combined with her knowledge and skill, there was always the personal interest. The following anecdote, related to the author by a lady who was then living in Rome, is revealing. One day, Dr. Montessori was called in to attend two small babies, twins, who were so near death's door that their father had said, "Why trouble to get a doctor? They are already dead." The parents were very poor and unable to afford either household help or nursing. On her arrival, the young lady doctor took in the whole situation at a glance. Taking off her coat, she lit the fire, sent the mother to bed, heated some water, bathed the two babies, holding them in a special way, prepared their food, and thus little by little, hour by hour, brought them back to life. Servant, cook, nurse, and doctor in one. Years later, when this same mother with her children met this dottoressa in the street, she would push them towards her, saying, "Go and salute that lady, my dear. She is your real mother, not I. She gave you your life." A pretty compliment, and well-deserved. If this was typical of Dr. Montessori's way of treating her indigent private patients, and from other sources one gathers it was certainly a good thing for her that she was not dependent for her livelihood on her private practice. Happily, as we have seen, she had other irons in the fire, such as her appointment at the psychiatric clinic, her lectureship at the training college, and later, her professorship in anthropology at the university. But the time was coming, and coming quite soon, though as yet she did not know it, when she would abandon her private practice, resign all her lectureships, and set forth like Columbus across unknown and uncharted seas to discover a new world. Reader's notes. I gotta say, I think this is why most people long for the days of house calls, because that was very beautiful. And it can't be easy to burn so many candles at so many ends. The woman must have had an entire candelabra. But I'm impressed. That's something we forget. Great people have many things in common that are amazing, but one of them, it is not easy to learn to do that many things, as well as still be present in the moment, and who you truly are. That takes a lot of hard work and planning.